Hello. Today I'm going to talk about Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. Now, the reason why I wanted to read it was because I read an article about how Peter Thiel, who was one of the original creators of PayPal, was really inspired by this book, and he had this conversation with another PayPal founder person, and they kind of were inspired to create PayPal. So, Snow Crash basically takes place in this futuristic reality where there's been this huge financial crisis. There's been like kind of a collapse of America and maybe other states. And people are living in this kind of future where money is different, where society and culture is different. Basically, the story follows this sort of hacker pizza delivery guy named Hiro. He is delivering a pizza and he has a little bit of trouble and he ends up being helped by this girl named YT, or Yours Truly. After she helps him, they decide to partner up and be a team on gathering intel. Like a decent amount of the story kind of takes place in a metaverse, and so Hiro's like this like kind of big shot in the metaverse. In the metaverse, Hiro gets this file. And it's called Snow Crash, and he's kind of like curious about it, but he's hesitant to look. He then hears about one of his friends or like another hacker who looked at this file, Snow Crash, and it ended up that he had like a seizure or something, and then he ended up potentially being brain dead. So this help makes Hiro very hesitant to look at the file, and he's concerned. And he wants to investigate like what's going on. Hiro's ex-girlfriend shows up, and she gives him this like sort of data file or this data dump of information gathered by this guy named Lagos, and the information in this file is looking at the Sumerian culture, the ancient Sumerian culture, and how it could be potentially related to this Snow Crash thing. Meanwhile, YT meets up with this mafia guy. His name is Enzo, and he likes her work, and he kind of takes a liking to her, so he makes a contract with her, or he makes an agreement with her to provide her with work to do. And so she develops this relationship with this mafia guy. Hiro and YT are doing like sort of independent research and discovery. They realize that there's this neurolinguistic virus, there's this religious organization, and then there's this like kind of media guy who's potentially behind all of this stuff. After going through Lagos's data, Hiro realizes that there's some kind of connection between the Sumerian cultures or Sumerian language and this Snow Crash virus. And it seems like there's also like a virus that actually manipulates or changes or alters people's DNA. We learn that the Sumerian culture was organized around these priests who had these like sort of chants or words that they said, and they were kind of like viruses because they modified the people's thinking or behavior. There's this person, Enki, who ended up realizing that these viruses were a problem or that they were causing issues, and creates this antidote to the virus. As a result, though, languages become simpler or less complex and not as able to directly interface with people's like brains and thinking and behaviors. And this kind of relates to the eventual story of the Tower of Babel. We then find out that this media magnate, or the person who we talked about a little bit before, and his name is L. Bob Reif. I'm like tempted to think like L. Ron Hubbard. That's the guy who is responsible for Scientology. This, when I read the name now, I kind of like associate the two. I don't know if there's any relation or any inspiration there. So this L. Bob Reif guy is collecting Sumerian artifacts, and they're somehow kind of being used, or they're related to this virus. And he's trying to develop new viruses, or he's trying to develop new ways of controlling people and their thinking and stuff. And obviously he has lots of money, so he has this kind of power to do that. We discover that there is the digital virus that is Snow Crash, and then there's also actually this virus that can be spread through blood. And so people actually are being infected in two different ways, but essentially it's the same virus, it's the same infection, it's the same thing trying to modify people's thoughts and behaviors. So, and because of the financial crisis, there's this big raft of people from Europe, and they're all gathered together. This raft is floating through the ocean, and it's headed towards the west coast of America. So for this reason, Hiro heads there because that is where L. Bob Reif is. And kind of the idea of this raft is that everyone on the raft has been infected by this virus, and the raft is headed towards the coast because they want to infect America with the virus. And L. Bob Reif, he's the leader of this raft, or he's in the center of it, so his boat's in the middle, and then there's all these other rafts connected around it, and it's floating through the ocean. YT is somehow kidnapped and brought to the raft, and then she's being held hostage. So Hiro, with Enzo and his mafia help, they attack the raft, and they're able to save YT. At the same time, Hiro is able to capture an antidote to this virus, and then he reads it out, and it kind of frees everyone from the trance from the virus that they've been infected with. After this, Rife flees from the ship. He tries to get on a private plane. He's captured. He gets killed. And then basically everyone lives happily ever after. So this book was kind of interesting to me because of this idea of these Sumerian cultures, and this idea of like languages being a tool or like a way of modifying people's behaviors and thinking. And like that's obviously true, right? Because like the things that we hear, the things that we learn, they influence us, they control us in a way, or at least they guide us to behave in a certain way. And so like this idea of like, or the way of seeing it as like a virus is pretty interesting. Even though it's like a made up story, like it has this like kind of influence, or it has changed my thinking about like things. And so I find that like curious. So you have this like book talking about these like languages that change people's minds or behaviors and stuff. And that, at the same time, it's like by reading that book, like I have had my mind changed in a way, and that's like fiction, right? So like it's not even necessarily something that's true, but it's kind of influenced my thinking. Another interesting idea about this is that there's this financial crisis, and it kind of creates these regions or these areas where the rules are different, where they have their own currencies. And so people like want to belong to these different sort of corporations because like it provides them with power and the ability to interact with the world. At the same time, like this crisis also makes people flee from certain parts of the world to other parts of the world, which always happens, right? Like even you could say that's happening right now. I think too, the idea of this hyperinflation that takes place and this like need to create alternative currencies is a lot of people these days are afraid of or concerned about inflation. It's a big deal. And at the same time, we have like these alternative currencies, which potentially enable us to sidestep or deal with the inflation problem. This book inspired Peter Thiel to create PayPal, and I think when they created PayPal, they were trying to create this like alternative currency. Bitcoin was created as like an actual alternative currency. I think there's like a little bit of an interesting connection there. Maybe the person who was inspired to create Bitcoin was also inspired by this book, the same way that Peter Thiel and maybe Elon Musk as well were inspired by this book. So this book was written in 1992, and it talks about this idea of the metaverse. And then here we are today in 2022, and we have Meta is now the new name of Facebook, and their product that they're working towards is the metaverse. And so this book, 30 years in advance, is kind of making this prediction about like how people interact with reality. And like, here we are kind of headed down that path. There's also like the hyper-capitalism. So because these independent regions have their own currencies, they have their own laws, and it's all like, it's money, right? Like instead of like countries and democracies, it's like, it's money. It's kind of like a metaphor a little bit, because I would say like that is essentially like where we are or where we're headed, and it's becoming more of a thing. Like a country is a thing, but like really it's about money, it's about power. That's kind of like the higher level, because we have like international corporations that like don't have to follow the rules of any country because they have the financial means to like operate outside of any country, or at least they choose the countries that have the most lax rules for them, and they make their like sort of headquarters there, and then they dip their toes into the countries that they want to be involved in. In a way, this idea is like a more like sort of blatant representation of it, but essentially that's how things are today. Maybe not as scary and as dangerous, but at least similar in concept. Like I really like this book. It has really changed my thinking about things, especially when it comes to like finances, or when it comes to cryptocurrencies or alternative currencies, about the finances of economies, about the risks of like inflation and all those things. And as I do this review now, I think a lot about like what's happening right now, and it kind of makes a lot of sense. And also too, as I mentioned earlier, like the idea of the languages having these like powers over people, that's something too that's kind of stuck in my mind, even though like it might be just made up. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think of Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson in the comments below. Click that like button and subscribe if you're curious about watching more videos in the future. Thanks for watching. We'll talk next time. Goodbye.